I often ask questions about religion, about gods, about the unknown, things like that, right? Because I need answers. I'd be very curious to get an understanding, especially when it comes to religion. Why do people believe what they believe with no evidence to back it up? Why do we believe things just because someone wrote it in a book for us to believe it? For instance, if we know the book is being tampered with, it's a fact that there has been books added and there has been books taken away. That means the book is a tampered with book by humans. Humans are tampering with a so-called God's so-called word. Now, first of all, we can't even prove that a God or gods ever said anything to anybody ever in life. We can't prove it. We can't prove that this book that people love to follow and quote from, called a Bible, we can't prove a God ever told anyone ever to write one word in that book. So why do we believe this is a word of a God? Why? Prayer. I find a lot of issues with prayer. Now I'm going to ask this question. If we can't even prove that a God ever told anyone to write a word of this book, I know what you believe. I know what you've been taught. I know what you've been brainwashed to believe. I'm talking about facts, though. Evidence. No one can prove a God ever in any point in history told a human to write anything in a book. You can't even prove that a God ever told anyone to write anything on a stone. This can't be proven. But we do know humans have done this. They've wrote things and said, somebody told us a God said something. And we just believe it for some reason. Because somebody said it was a God that said it. My question is, if we can't prove a God ever said a word to write in that book, we can't even prove a God ever spoke a word. We can't even prove that a God has any interest in anything in that book. Even prayer. Whoever confirmed that a God chooses to answer a thing called a prayer, something called a prayer, where did that come from? Where did prayer come from? And who said a God said it would answer anything? Whoever said a God said it would acknowledge a prayer? What if it's not a God's job or these God's job to acknowledge a prayer? What if this God or these God's job is just to create and either die or move on? Where did prayer come from? Who said a God answers a thing called a prayer? Something called a prayer. Who said who said that? Who confirmed that any God spoke to anybody about a thing called a prayer? A prayer. Like, who confirmed? that a God spoke a word ever to anybody, one person, two people, three people, anybody, whoever said that a God speaks. Prayer. People always talking about this prayer thing. Who can prove a God even cares about a prayer? Maybe that's not what a God cares about. Maybe a creator gave you a brain with tools to use to figure things out where you're at in this life you're in. Maybe you were created to figure shit out and not just believe shit. You can't prove a God ever said anything about a prayer. You can't prove a God told you to pray. You can't prove a God said he'd answer a prayer. You can't prove a God said he'd acknowledge a prayer. You can't prove a God said he might answer a prayer. He might not answer a prayer. You can't prove any of that. So why do you even believe that? One thing we can prove is that a human wrote that a God mentions, acknowledges a thing called prayer in a book that humans have tampered with and called it the word of a God. What if God don't give a shit about a prayer? His job or its job or their jobs or her job was to simply create and move on or die after creation. I just try to figure out, I know what you believe. I know what you were told to believe. I know what you were brainwashed to believe. I'm just trying to understand, why do you believe it though? Without no evidence to back it up. Something to think about, I think.